They fired me on a Friday afternoon with a rusty keychain and a 10-page severance agreement. They thought I was just the invisible admin who refilled the printers. What the arrogant new chief executive officer did not realize was that I held the exclusive biometric keys to a $600 million merger. By the time they figured it out, they had exactly 48 hours before their entire corporate empire collapsed into dust. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without an operating budget to keep bringing you these intricate tales of karma. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting our work by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story about my life, and my name is Brooklyn Price. I am 38 years old, and I have spent the last 15 years of my life as an administrative coordinator at EtherVault, a cloud data storage company nestled in the chilly altitude of Denver, Colorado. 15 years is an absolute eternity in the tech industry. It is long enough to watch a company evolve from a scrappy, desperate startup operating out of a damp, poorly ventilated garage into a gleaming, sterile corporate entity. Over those 15 years, I slowly morphed into the invisible connective tissue that held the entire office together. I was the person who kept all the internal Wi-Fi passwords memorized when the IT department experienced complete turnover. I knew the exact server maintenance schedules by heart, catching errors before they crashed our systems. I knew that the chief financial officer needed 2 pumps of sugar-free vanilla in his oat milk latte every single morning to prevent a catastrophic midday meltdown, and that the vice president of sales was severely allergic to tree nuts. I held the literal and metaphorical keys to the daily, unseen functioning of the business. Yet, despite dedicating a decade and a half to keeping EtherVault afloat, not a single executive sitting comfortably in those glass-walled boardrooms could ever bother to remember my actual last name. To them, I was just the girl at the desk, the furniture, the quiet fixture that ordered the toner and magically made their administrative headaches disappear. There was a rigid, unspoken caste system at EtherVault. The executives and software engineers were the untouchable royalty who dined on catered sushi and enjoyed unlimited paid time off. Meanwhile, the operations team were the peasants who made sure the corporate machinery actually worked. We were entirely invisible, until something broke. The atmosphere in the office shifted dramatically about 6 months ago. Whispers of a monumental acquisition began to circulate through the break room. We were in the final stages of preparing to be swallowed whole by a massive global tech conglomerate. Suddenly, the relaxed, collaborative Denver vibe was replaced by a suffocating, palpable tension. The hallways were crawling with unfamiliar, sharp-eyed men in impeccably tailored suits, roaming our floors like vultures circling a dying animal. They were auditing us, measuring every square inch of our operation to justify a $600 million price tag. To ensure the company looked as sleek, modern, and insanely profitable as humanly possible, before the ink dried on the merger documents, the board of directors brought in a new chief executive officer. His name was Julian Vance. Julian was a textbook product of Silicon Valley arrogance. He was barely 30 years old, wore hideous designer sneakers that cost more than my monthly rent, and spoke entirely in empty corporate buzzwords like paradigm shift and disruptive ideation. He did not care about the history of the company or the exhausted people who had built it from the ground up. He was hired for one singular, ruthless purpose, which was to optimize the machinery and trim the fat. From the very first day he swaggered into the lobby, Julian made it abundantly clear where I stood in his grand vision of the corporate future. Nowhere. He refused to even call me Brooklyn. Every single morning as he breezed past my desk, staring obsessively down at his phone, he would throw out a careless, dismissive greeting. "Morning, Brooke. Get me those quarterly files. Brooke, order my lunch." Brooke, I corrected him exactly twice. He smiled a patronizing, hollow smile both times, only to call me Brooke again the very next day. It was a deliberate power play, a subtle way of reminding me that I was far too insignificant to occupy a permanent space in his highly optimized brain. Then came the corporate slaughter. To dress up the financial reports and make EtherVault look incredibly lean for the acquiring conglomerate, Julian began systematically terminating people. He did not go after the bloated middle management or the useless consultants billing $200 an hour. He went straight for the foundation. He fired the long-time administrative assistants, the operations veterans, the quiet people who actually knew how the company functioned on a day-to-day basis. Julian stood in front of the entire company during a dreadful Friday town hall meeting, pacing back and forth with a wireless microphone like a cheap motivational speaker. "We are entering a new era of digital innovation," Julian announced to the terrified, silent crowd, gesturing wildly with his hands. "To survive in this modern corporate ecosystem, we must shed the legacy dead weight that holds us back from true agility. We are automating, we are streamlining, and we are moving toward a fully digitized horizon." I sat in the back row, perfectly still, watching him deliver his perfectly rehearsed corporate poison. I watched my friends, people who had poured the best years of their lives into making EtherVault a success, pack their cheap cardboard boxes, while Julian patted himself on the back for artificially increasing our profit margin by a fraction of a percent. I knew my turn was coming. The invisible admin was nothing but a tiny red line on his bloated financial spreadsheet. But what Julian, in his infinite, arrogant wisdom, completely failed to understand was that sometimes the dead weight is the only thing keeping the entire ship anchored to reality, and my anchor was buried far deeper than anyone in that glass tower could ever comprehend. The execution finally arrived on a dreary Friday afternoon at exactly 3:45. That is the universal corporate execution hour. They always wait until the week is basically over, so you do not have the time or the energy to cause a scene, rally your coworkers, or contact a lawyer before Monday morning. My desk phone blinked with a single, sterile message demanding my immediate presence in Conference Room B. I knew exactly what that meant. Conference Room B was a windowless, suffocating glass box located down the hall from the Human Resources Department, unofficially known by the veteran staff as the slaughterhouse. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothed down my sensible gray skirt, and walked the familiar 70 feet down the muted, carpeted corridor. Waiting for me inside was Chloe, our director of human resources. Chloe was a woman who possessed the terrifying, sociopathic ability to fire you while maintaining a pasted-on, eerily bright smile that never quite reached her dead. Empty eyes. She sat perfectly rigid behind the faux mahogany table, her hands neatly clasped, exuding the synthetic sympathy of someone who had practiced this exact termination speech in her rearview mirror during her morning commute. "Please, take a seat, Brooklyn," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial, rehearsed sweetness. There was a painfully thin manila envelope resting on the table directly between us. 15 years of my absolute dedication, late nights, skipped lunches, and putting out literal and figurative operational fires, all reduced to a piece of paper barely thicker than a fast food napkin. "As you know," Chloe began, launching effortlessly into the heavily scripted corporate jargon, "EtherVault is undergoing a massive structural realignment to prepare for the upcoming merger. Unfortunately, as we transition toward a fully automated, digitized ecosystem, your current role as administrative coordinator has been rendered redundant." Redundant. It was such a polite, clinical way of saying they had wrung every last ounce of usefulness out of my body, and were now casually tossing the empty husk into the incinerator. She slid the pathetic envelope across the table. Inside was a severance offer so utterly cheap it felt like a physical slap to the face. 4 weeks of severance pay. That was it. 4 weeks of basic salary to compensate for a decade and a half of unwavering loyalty. And resting right on top of the 10-page non-disclosure and severance agreement was a parting gift. It was a cheap, metallic keychain bearing the outdated Ethervault logo. The edges of the metal were actually beginning to rust. They were giving me promotional garbage from the supply closet that nobody else wanted, treating it like a grand, magnanimous token of appreciation for giving them my youth. Before I could even fully process the sheer audacity of the rusty keychain, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. Julian Vance strolled in, looking entirely unbothered, clutching his sleek silver tablet. He did not pull up a chair. He barely even made eye contact with me. Instead, he stood near the doorway, impatiently tapping his perfectly manicured fingers against the edge of the table, treating my termination like a minor nuisance holding up his afternoon schedule. "I just wanted to drop in personally," Julian said, his tone flat and utterly devoid of genuine human empathy. "Thank you for keeping the printers fully stocked with paper for the past decade. Brooke, you really helped keep the lights on around here in the early days. But as I am sure Chloe has already explained, the acquiring firm demands full digital transformation across the board. We just do not have the financial bandwidth for legacy administrative overhead anymore. Good luck with your future endeavors." He gave a single, curt nod, turned on his expensive designer heel, and vanished back into the hallway to probably ruin someone else's life. He could not even be bothered to get my name right on the very day he was destroying my livelihood. Chloe clasped her hands again, offering me a cheap blue plastic pen. "If you could just sign on the dotted line at the bottom of page 10, we can process your final paycheck by the end of the business day." I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not flip the table, demand justice, or curse Julian's name, even though a younger, more naive version of myself might have done all of those things. Working in corporate America for 15 years strips you of your dramatic, emotional impulses and replaces them with a cold, hardened armor of pure pragmatism. Instead of reacting, I picked up the 10-page legal document. I read it. I did not just skim it. I performed a meticulous, calculating scan of every single paragraph, clause, and tiny footnote that Julian's flashy, overpriced corporate lawyers had drafted. I read through the aggressive non-compete clauses, the waiver of rights to sue for wrongful termination, and the mandatory surrender of all company assets. And right there, buried deep in the dense, dry legal text regarding the immediate handover of physical and digital access protocols, I saw it. I saw a gaping, fatal flaw. It was a legal blind spot so massive, so incredibly negligent, that I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to suppress a genuine smile. Julian and his team of arrogant attorneys had been so completely obsessed with their modern cloud-based digital assets that they had entirely overlooked the foundational, physical bedrock of the company. They had failed to run a proper due diligence check on the legacy vendor contracts. The silence in the room stretched on, becoming heavy and increasingly uncomfortable for Chloe, who was clearly used to terminated employees either sobbing uncontrollably or angrily scribbling their signature just to escape the humiliation of the room. I kept my face an absolute, unreadable mask. I did not touch the plastic pen she offered. Instead, I slowly, deliberately folded the 10-page severance agreement in half. I picked up the rusty, insulting keychain, slipped both items into my black leather handbag, and snapped the brass clasp shut with a definitive, sharp click. Chloe's fake, bright smile faltered for the very first time, genuine confusion creeping into her perfectly arched eyebrows. "I will not be signing this today." "Chloe," I said, my voice smooth, perfectly polite, and entirely devoid of fear. "A legal document of this magnitude requires careful, deliberate consideration. I need to take this home and review it thoroughly before I formally sever my ties with this building." I stood up from the uncomfortable chair, smoothing my skirt one final time. I looked down at her, offering a gentle, chilling smile of my own. "Have a wonderful weekend." Without waiting for her to formulate a panicked corporate response, I turned and walked out of the glass door, leaving the suffocating slaughterhouse behind me forever, carrying the exact weapon I needed to tear their shiny $600 million empire completely down to the ground. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of gray highway and the rhythmic, steady hum of my tires against the cold pavement. I did not stop at a bar to drown my sorrows in cheap liquor. I did not desperately call my mother or my friends to cry about the profound unfairness of corporate America. I simply walked into my modest, dimly lit apartment, slid the deadbolt firmly into place, and dropped my heavy leather handbag onto the kitchen counter. The silence of the empty room felt distinctly different tonight. It was not the usual, heavy silence of a lonely Friday evening. Instead, it was a pregnant, highly electric silence, the exact kind of atmospheric drop in pressure that occurs right before a massive, destructive storm breaks over the horizon. I walked straight into my bedroom, got down on my knees, and reached deep beneath the wooden frame of my bed. My fingers brushed past a stack of old winter blankets until they found the heavy, freezing cold steel handle of a portable, fireproof safe box. I pulled it out, feeling its immense weight drag and scrape slightly against the hardwood floor. I sat cross-legged on the rug and reached for the dial. 3, 18, 42. The heavy internal latch disengaged with a deeply satisfying metallic clank that echoed off the bedroom walls. Inside the reinforced steel box, nestled securely beneath my passport, my birth certificate, and a handful of faded family photographs, was a single, unmarked manila folder. It held a stack of distinctly yellowed, slightly crinkled paper that smelled faintly of old ink and dust. It was a commercial infrastructure lease agreement, dated exactly 12 years ago. 12 years ago, Ethervault was absolutely nothing like the sleek, intimidating corporate titan sitting in those gleaming glass towers today. It was a desperate, chaotic, and rapidly drowning startup operating out of a cramped, poorly insulated commercial warehouse on the wrong side of the city. The original founders of the company, three brilliant but incredibly disorganized software engineers, who had long since been bought out and retired to private islands, had completely maxed out their corporate credit lines. They were actively hemorrhaging money, dodging daily phone calls from aggressive debt collectors, and their personal credit scores were utterly obliterated. But they had a critical problem. They desperately needed a secure, climate-controlled, military-grade facility to house their very first, highly sensitive physical computer servers. No reputable commercial real estate landlord in the entire state of Colorado would even look at their application without a massive, upfront cash deposit or a pristine financial guarantor. Enter a 26-year-old Brooklyn Price. I was young, fiercely loyal to the vision of the company, and most importantly, I possessed a flawless, perfect credit score of exactly 815. The founders took me out for cheap draft beer and a stale pepperoni pizza, practically begging me to sign the master lease agreement for the server facility under my own personal legal name. They swore up and down, promising me on their lives that it was just a temporary bureaucratic formality to get the company through a brutal fiscal quarter. They promised they would transfer all the legal paperwork into the official company name the absolute second they secured their series of venture capital funding. I was naive. I believed in them. I took the pen and signed my name on the dotted line. However, that temporary formality quietly morphed into a permanent, entirely forgotten artifact of the company history. As Ethervault successfully secured their funding, exploded in size, and transitioned aggressively into the modern cloud computing era. The entire landscape of the company shifted. The finance department, which became a rapidly revolving door of outsourced accountants and new vice presidents, simply noted the monthly rental fee for that underground server facility and placed it on a permanent, automated payment schedule. It was a microscopic, recurring expense buried deep within a sprawling, multi-million-dollar operational budget. Nobody ever questioned it. But far more importantly, nobody ever bothered to update the archaic, physical security protocols at the remote storage facility itself. The vendor we rented from was not a standard office building. It was an ultra-secure, subterranean data fortress carved directly into the solid granite bedrock of a decommissioned military installation just outside the city limits. Because I was the legally binding primary leaseholder listed on the original contract, the facility's intensely paranoid. Ironclad security system required my actual physical presence to establish the master access rights. The bunker did not use plastic keycards or easily hackable digital passwords that an IT department could remotely reset. It utilized a closed-loop, completely air-gapped biometric authentication sequence to even unlock the reinforced steel blast doors leading to our proprietary server rack. The overarching security system required a perfectly matched fingerprint, a localized retinal scan, and a live voice print reading a randomly generated phrase. And 12 years ago, the only biological data they logged into that immovable, analog mainframe belonged exclusively to me. As EtherVault grew into a global behemoth, the new wave of modern tech executives, exactly like Julian Vance, developed a fatal, arrogant allergy to physical hardware. They operated entirely in the theoretical, invisible realm of wireless cloud architecture and infinite digital dashboards. They completely forgot that their most valuable, world-changing digital assets still required a physical, tangible home. And that brings us to the ultimate, $600 million secret. The massive global conglomerate that was currently auditing EtherVault was not buying our company for our sleek office furniture, our marketing team, or our generic customer mailing list. They were paying an astronomical fortune for one specific, highly coveted piece of intellectual property. It was a revolutionary artificial intelligence compression algorithm, a master key of intricate code that could instantly shrink massive datasets by 80% without losing a single microscopic pixel of quality. It was the absolute crown jewel of EtherVault, because this algorithm was so incredibly valuable and so highly vulnerable to corporate espionage or devastating cyber attacks. The board of directors had legally mandated that the master, uncorrupted offline seed code be stored locally. It had to remain entirely disconnected from the internet, resting securely on an isolated server rack. That specific billion-dollar server rack was currently sitting quietly in the pitch-black dark, breathing cool, conditioned air, locked tightly inside the very same underground military bunker I had personally rented 12 years prior. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of Julian's catastrophic mistake washed over me in a glorious, intoxicating wave of pure adrenaline. He had spent the last 3 months aggressively acting like a corporate butcher, cutting vital operational costs, firing the veteran staff, and polishing the company's financial facade to impress the wealthy buyers. He was so incredibly arrogant, so completely hyper-focused on his beautiful digital spreadsheets, that he fundamentally failed to recognize the invisible, unbreakable tether connecting his entire corporate empire to one single, administrative employee. By handing me that ridiculous severance package, taking my security badge, and arrogantly banishing me from the building, Julian Vance had just unwittingly locked himself out of his own kingdom. Without my right index finger, without my retinas, and without the precise, unique cadence of my vocal cords, not a single powerful executive, expensive corporate lawyer, or brilliant software engineer could ever step foot past those heavy steel blast doors. The underground security facility was contractually obligated to deny entry to anyone who was not the verified master leaseholder, and their heavily armed security guards were completely immune to corporate bullying or legal threats. If EtherVault could not physically access that offline server to extract and hand over the proprietary artificial intelligence algorithm to the conglomerate, the entire acquisition would instantly vaporize into thin air. They would have absolutely no tangible assets to deliver to the buyer, constituting a massive breach of contract. I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet apartment, staring down at the yellowed paper resting in my hands, a cold, predatory smile slowly spreading across my face. Julian thought I was just a pathetic piece of legacy dead weight. He was about to find out that I was the entire foundation holding up the floor beneath his expensive designer sneakers, and I was about to calmly step aside and let his entire glass castle shatter into a million jagged pieces. For the next 3 weeks, I completely vanished from the corporate grid. I rented a gorgeous, secluded cedar cabin nestled high up in a quiet mountain town, hundreds of miles away from the polluted air and the suffocating stress of Denver. I spent my mornings sitting on a wooden deck wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sipping hot black coffee, and watching the morning fog roll gently over the pine trees. My company issued smartphone, which I had conveniently forgotten to surrender on my way out of the building, was buried at the very bottom of my suitcase, completely powered down. Every few days, I would briefly log into my personal email on my laptop, just to be endlessly amused by the desperate, automated messages piling up in my inbox from Chloe and Human Resources. First, they were standard. Polite reminders to digitally sign the severance agreement. Then, they shifted to brightly colored, slightly urgent notifications about my final paycheck being held up. I simply deleted them all with a single click, closed the laptop, and went for long, peaceful hikes in the woods. While I was busy breathing in the crisp mountain air and listening to the quiet chirping of the birds, the absolute pinnacle of corporate chaos was quietly unfolding back in Denver. The acquiring conglomerate was finally concluding their rigorous due diligence phase. They had scrutinized the financial spreadsheets, audited the employee payrolls, and reviewed the digital marketing strategies. There was only one final, monumental step left before they transferred the $600 million. They needed to physically verify the existence and the operational integrity of the proprietary artificial intelligence algorithm. Julian Vance, overflowing with his usual nauseating confidence, assembled a massive, intimidating entourage. He gathered his highest-paid software engineers, his most aggressive corporate lawyers in their $3,000 bespoke suits, and the lead executives from the buying conglomerate. They drove out to the desolate, remote military installation in a fleet of black luxury utility vehicles, expecting to casually stroll in, point at a blinking server rack, and pop a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate their historic merger. Their grand, triumphant parade hit a massive, impenetrable brick wall the absolute second they stepped into the subterranean reception area. The facility was guarded by private, heavily armed security personnel who did not care about designer suits, fancy corporate titles, or shiny digital tablets. Julian stepped forward, flashing his Chief Executive Officer badge, and demanded immediate access to Vault Number 7. The stone-faced security captain simply pointed to a heavy reinforced steel door equipped with a glowing red biometric scanner. Julian confidently instructed his lead engineer to plug a decryption drive into the terminal. The second the cable connected, a harsh, blaring siren echoed through the concrete hallway. The system instantly flashed a blinding red error message across the main monitor. Biometric mismatch. Exclusive master authorization required. Julian scoffed, visibly annoyed by the inconvenience in front of the wealthy buyers. He snapped his fingers at his lead attorney, ordering him to fix the problem. The attorney confidently slapped a stack of legal injunctions, corporate ownership documents, and executive override mandates onto the security desk, threatening to have the entire facility shut down by the end of the business day if they did not open the door immediately. The security captain did not even flinch. He slowly picked up a heavy desk phone, dialed a 3-digit extension, and summoned the facility manager. The manager emerged from a back office, carrying a thick, physical binder. He calmly opened it to a specific, heavily highlighted page and slid it across the desk toward the enraged corporate lawyers. "You can waive all the corporate paperwork you want," the facility manager said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "This specific vault operates under an ironclad, legacy security protocol. The biometric lock is permanently hardwired to a single authorized individual. If you attempt to forcefully drill through that steel door, if you try to cut the localized power grid, or if you run another decryption program through that terminal, you will instantly trigger our absolute containment protocol. The internal system will flood the server rack with a highly corrosive chemical agent and physically incinerate every single hard drive in that room to prevent data theft. That is the agreement your company signed 12 years ago. We do not break protocol for anyone." The blood completely drained from Julian's face. He stared at the heavy steel door, suddenly realizing that the $600 million algorithm was trapped inside a literal, impenetrable tomb, and any attempt to break in would permanently destroy the very asset they were trying to sell. The lead executives from the acquiring conglomerate, who had been silently watching this entire humiliating spectacle unfold, lost their patience entirely. They were not paying a fortune for a company that did not even have access to its own primary product. The lead buyer turned to Julian, his face flushed with unadulterated fury. "This is a complete circus," the buyer spat out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You assured us that your infrastructure was fully optimized and ready for immediate handover. Now we find out you are locked out of your own core assets. Listen to me very carefully. Julian, we are giving you exactly 48 hours. If you cannot produce the physical keys to open that vault and verify the algorithm by Friday morning, we are officially terminating the acquisition, and the very next morning, our legal department will file a massive lawsuit against EtherVault for gross misrepresentation and corporate fraud that will bury you in bankruptcy court for the next 10 years. The buyers turned around and marched out of the facility, leaving Julian and his entire team of useless, highly paid experts standing in the freezing, silent concrete hallway, staring blankly at a locked door they could never open. The ticking clock had officially started, and the suffocating silence of their impending doom had finally begun to set in. Back at the pristine EtherVault headquarters, the perfectly manicured executive floor devolved into absolute, unfiltered pandemonium. The frantic hunt for the original vendor contract tore through the polished veneer of the company like a hurricane. Junior assistants were dispatched to the basement archives, choking on dust as they ripped open cardboard boxes that had not seen the light of day in over a decade. When a terrified intern finally sprinted into the glass boardroom clutching a faded photocopy of the 12-year-old lease agreement, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Julian Vance snatched the paper from the intern's trembling hands. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon until they locked onto the single line dictating the master biometric access rights. Printed right there, in bold, undeniable ink, was the name Brooklyn Price. The sheer gravity of the situation slammed into Julian's chest with the force of a freight train. He collapsed heavily into his ergonomic leather chair, his arrogant posture completely dissolving. The invisible, middle-aged administrative coordinator that he had mocked, belittled, and tossed out into the street with a rusty corporate keychain was the sole biological key to the entire $600 million empire. He had literally fired the only person on the planet who could save him from professional ruin and a decade of fraud litigation. Up in my quiet mountain cabin, I finally decided it was time to plug my company smartphone into the wall charger. The exact moment the screen illuminated, the device essentially exploded in my hands. It vibrated so violently and continuously that it nearly danced off the wooden kitchen counter. Dozens upon dozens of missed calls, frantic text messages, and urgent voicemails flooded the screen in a desperate, endless stream. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, walked out onto the deck, and leisurely listened to the escalating stages of corporate grief. The first few voicemails were from Chloe in Human Resources. Her artificial, heavily rehearsed sweetness was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, trembling panic. She begged me to call her back immediately, babbling incoherently about a terrible clerical error regarding my termination. The next batch of messages came from the high-priced legal department. They tried their usual aggressive tactics, shouting into the receiver, threatening me with catastrophic lawsuits, criminal sabotage charges, and immediate injunctions if I did not report to the underground facility within the hour. I actually laughed out loud at the majestic pine trees. I knew exactly what they knew. I had not signed a single page of their exit agreement. I was no longer an employee. I was not bound by any operational mandates, and you cannot legally sue an unemployed civilian for simply existing and going on a mountain vacation. Then, the screen lit up with an incoming call from a number I recognized instantly. It was Julian Vance himself. I took a slow sip of my coffee, leaned back in my wooden chair, and calmly counted the rings. 1, 2, 3. I let the phone vibrate in my palm. 7, 8, 9. I imagined him pacing wildly in his glass office, sweating through his expensive designer shirt. 12, 13, 14. On the 15th ring, just a fraction of a second before it diverted to voicemail. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear. "Brooklyn!" Julian gasped into the receiver, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of breathless desperation and barely contained rage. "Where on earth are you? We need you down at the subterranean vault right now. The buyer is threatening to pull the plug. You have to open the master server door." I let his panicked breathing fill the silence on the line for a long, agonizing moment. "I am sorry. Who is this calling?" I asked, keeping my voice as flat and freezing as the mountain air around me. "It is Julian," he shouted, clearly losing whatever tiny shred of composure he had left. "Julian Vance, the Chief Executive Officer of Ethervault. Stop playing games. Brooklyn, this is a matter of life and death for the company. We can pay you for your time today. We can double your severance package. Just get down here." "Oh, Julian," I replied smoothly, emphasizing his name with a sickeningly polite tone. "I am afraid you must have the wrong number. You fired me almost a month ago. I believe your exact words were that I was legacy dead weight blocking the new era of digital innovation. Dead weight does not have a legal obligation to bail you out of your own catastrophic mismanagement." "Please," Julian begged, entirely abandoning his Silicon Valley pride. He was practically sobbing into the phone. "I will do anything. You are destroying my career. If we do not open that door in 24 hours, they are going to sue me into oblivion." "You destroyed your own career when you forgot to read the foundation of the house you were trying to sell," I countered sharply, the ice in my voice sharpening into a lethal blade. "I am not returning to Ethervault. I am not stepping foot in that toxic building ever again, but I will offer you one single opportunity to resolve this." "Anything," he stammered immediately. "Name the place." "Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I commanded, dictating the terms with absolute, unquestionable authority. "You will bring the entire Ethervault board of directors, and you will meet me at the downtown headquarters of the conglomerate that is attempting to buy you. We are going to have a very honest conversation about the current market value of my fingerprint. Do not be late." I disconnected the call before he could utter another pathetic syllable, powered the phone completely off, and dropped it into the trash can. The board was set. The trap was firmly locked, and it was finally time to collect my dues. The 50th floor of the conglomerate headquarters was a literal fortress of modern capitalism, wrapped entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying view of the Denver skyline. When the heavy mahogany elevator doors slid open at exactly 9 o'clock, I stepped out, completely shedding the pathetic, invisible shell I had worn for the past decade and a half. I was not wearing my sensible, unassuming gray skirt today. Instead, I was dressed in an impeccably tailored, dark navy designer suit that armor-plated my entire demeanor. Every step I took against the polished marble floor echoed with absolute, undeniable authority. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the main executive boardroom. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly tense, completely saturated with the smell of expensive cologne and the sour stench of pure, unfiltered panic. The massive rectangular table was packed on both sides. On the left sat the furious, impatient executives of the acquiring conglomerate. On the right sat the terrified, crumbling board of directors from Ethervault. And sitting right at the center, looking like a man who had not slept or eaten in a week, was Julian Vance. His face was a ghastly shade of pale gray, and dark patches of sweat had completely soaked through the armpits of his expensive silk shirt. As I confidently took the single empty leather chair at the head of the table, Julian immediately jumped to his feet. He forced a pathetic, trembling smile, desperately trying to project a sense of control that had long since evaporated. "Brooklyn," Julian started, his voice cracking horribly. "Thank you for coming. I know we got off on the wrong foot, but we are all reasonable adults here. We can handle this quietly. Ethervault appreciates everything you have done, and we are prepared to offer you a highly generous, one-time consultation fee to accompany us to the vault today." He reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and slid a freshly printed cashier's check across the long glass table. I calmly reached out and stopped the piece of paper with my index finger. I looked down, It was a check made out for $50,000. To a billionaire, it was pocket change. To a displaced administrative worker, it was supposed to be a life-changing bribe. Julian thought he could simply buy his way out of his catastrophic failure with a tiny fraction of a percent of his own annual bonus. I did not utter a single word. I picked up the check, gripped the edges firmly, and ripped it directly down the middle. The sharp tearing sound echoed loudly in the dead silence of the room. I stacked the two halves, tore them again, and calmly let the worthless pieces of paper flutter down onto the pristine glass table. Julian gasped, taking a physical step backward as if I had just struck him. "My name is Brooklyn Price," I said, my voice dangerously soft, projecting clearly across the massive room. I locked my eyes onto the lead executive of the buying conglomerate, completely ignoring Julian. "And my biometric signature is not for sale for $50,000. Over the past few months, I watched this man dismantle the entire operational foundation of a perfectly functional company just to artificially inflate a spreadsheet. He is a textbook example of arrogant, short-sighted executive incompetence. He fired the veteran staff who actually understood how this business operated, and he did it without performing even a basic, fundamental risk management assessment on his own core assets. He built you a house of cards, and he forgot that I am the only person holding the table steady." I opened my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a single, neatly typed sheet of paper. I slid it firmly toward the chairman of the acquiring conglomerate. "I am not here to negotiate," I stated, leaning back into my chair with absolute command of the room. "These are my final, non-negotiable terms. In exchange for my physical presence and my biometric clearance to permanently unlock the subterranean server vault, I require exactly 2.5% equity in the newly merged corporate entity. Based on your $600 million valuation, that equates to a $15 million ownership stake. Furthermore, as a strict condition of my cooperation, Julian Vance is to be terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer immediately for gross negligence, with absolutely zero severance compensation." The entire room erupted into a momentary, chaotic frenzy of whispers. Julian turned completely white, sputtering wildly, frantically looking at his board members for support. "You cannot do this. You are insane. This is extortion." But the board of directors did not care about Julian. They cared about the $600 million deal that was currently flatlining on the operating table. The chairman of the buying conglomerate simply picked up my piece of paper, read it twice, and looked directly at the EtherVault board. The unspoken communication was instantaneous and brutally clear. Julian was the sacrificial lamb. It took less than 30 seconds. The lead investor from EtherVault cleared his throat, refusing to even look Julian in the eye. "Julian, your employment is terminated. Effective immediately. Please vacate the premises." "What?" Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "I built this deal. You cannot throw me out." The chairman simply raised his hand, and two massive, suited security guards immediately stepped inside the boardroom. They grabbed Julian firmly by both arms. The arrogant, untouchable Silicon Valley golden boy was physically dragged backward out of the glass room, kicking his expensive designer sneakers and shouting empty threats until the heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic cries forever. The room fell completely silent once again. The chairman pushed a thick, newly drafted, binding legal contract across the table toward me, securing my 2.5% equity in exchange for my fingerprints. I smiled warmly. I reached deep into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the exact same cheap, blue plastic pen securely attached to the rusty EtherVault promotional keychain that Human Resources had insultingly handed to me on the day they fired me. I clicked the pen, carefully signed my name on the dotted line, and stood up from the table as a newly minted multimillionaire. I walked out of that building as the absolute, undisputed winner, knowing that the invisible admin had finally taken the entire kingdom. Thank you so much to all of you amazing listeners for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop your city or country down in the comments below. If you enjoyed hearing about my corporate revenge and want to support our channel, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. You will get access to the absolute best, most thrilling, exclusive true stories featuring incredible voice acting that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can support us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located in the video description and pinned comment. Stay safe and never let anyone make you feel invisible.